And this is the 5-Minute Podcast Review for Monday, June 4, 2018. Into week 2 now of the format change experiment I'm running through June, trying to stick to 5 minutes or less by covering fewer podcasts per episode, but putting episodes out more frequently, aiming for once a week. So the first podcast this episode is The Ford by Lance Armstrong, and that's the disgraced Tour de France cyclist Lance Armstrong. The name of the podcast, The Ford, represents Lance's philosophy of dusting himself off and moving forward with his life. It's an interview/conversation podcast, and Lance has been prolific, pumping out episodes running around an hour, almost once a week for the past 2 years. As I said, the loose thread across the conversations is that of pressing forward in the face of adversity, and Lance Armstrong has definitely faced his share of adversity. Aside from the massive and very ugly fall from grace after admitting to doping, which resulted in being stripped of his 7 Tour de France titles, losing all his sponsors and generally being shunned by the world, apart from that, Lance has also survived a major battle with cancer. It's an interesting thing listening to this redemption of Lance Armstrong, and actually, I'd say for many listeners, just getting to know something of the real Lance Armstrong for the first time. There's a real chance you'll find yourself warming to Lance. Some of his guests include Lyle Lovett, Ryan Holiday, Malcolm Gladwell, singer-songwriter Seal, Special Forces sniper Tim Kennedy, Chris Evert. They're probably some of the better-known names, but most of the 90 or so guests have interesting stories to tell. I read an article on The Ford under the great headline, Outcast to Podcast, and it described Lance as, quote, this scrappy, street-smart, tell-it-like-it-is dude-bro character who you don't exactly like, but who's fun to hang out with, end quote. And I think that sums it up quite well. So go check out a few episodes and see what you make of Lance Armstrong's crack at podcasting. The link is on your screen. And just to finish on the theme of disgracing oneself takes us to the relatively new podcast, Disgraceland. Disgraceland could be summed up as true crime meets rock and roll. And listening to Disgraceland is a bit like finding yourself sitting in a bar late one night next to someone like a jaded roadie who's got stories to tell. They're incredible, entertaining stories, but you're not quite sure where the truth ends and the myth begins. Disgraceland's actually put together and presented by Jake Brennan, who isn't a roadie but has been around rock and roll all his life. Here's a bit of Jake from the intro episode of Disgraceland.
Disgraceland is the world's first and only rock and roll true crime podcast. I want to tell you the story surrounding the death of Mrs. Jerry Lee Lewis. And there are some other stories I'd like to tell you about too. Like the story about Sid Vicious and the circumstances surrounding his drug overdose. And let's dig into the chaos and mayhem behind the Norwegian black metal murders. The story's nuts. And so is the story about our loser baby Beck and his Church of Scientology and the Golden Suicides. Also, 22 years ago, Richie Edwards from Manic Street Preachers disappeared off the face of the earth. Richie, baby, where you been? And who burned down Tom Petty's house? We want to know. Rest in peace, Tom. We'll look into these stories and more in our first season. I've spent my entire life in and around rock and roll. And the one thing I know to be absolutely true is that the best rock stars, the most interesting, the most legit, they're the craziest. And they have the most insane things happen to them. Maybe because they're wired differently, more like feral narcissistic animals than functioning members of society. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing because this is what makes them so damn entertaining.
Okay, so there you go. 2 podcasts to check out, The Ford with Lance Armstrong and Disgraceland. Links to both are on your screen. And don't forget there's a whole lot of back episodes to check out with hundreds more podcasts to discover. I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening.